Welcome to BYJU'S IAS and welcome to our weekly review of international affairs, in which we try to have a dialogue with you, have a discussion and analysis in this session about what has been happening in the world, what are the major events, what are the issues, what are the individuals who have been influencing the international events, changing the power equations that ultimately affect our national interest. And we tend to focus on 21st century as far as possible, and from the keeping in mind the needs and requirements of the aspirations of civil service examinations, we try to focus in the past 4 or 5 years, because in international relations, in contemporary affairs, current affairs, that is the period which is most important. But then when we talk of the 21st century, we normally tend to focus on events and individuals more than the institutions. And the reasons for this are quite obvious. The 21st century started with a bang, and the bang of very traumatic nature. The Al-Qaeda attacked the United States of America, blasted to ground the twin World Trade Towers. Thousands of people died, and America was stupefied, stunned. And this started a policy of retaliation against Islamic terror. The then President Bush declared that this was a crusade, it was a clash of civilizations, and he said he would not let international law stand in his way to punish and bring the guilty to the book. Now, when this happened, he also enunciated a doctrine of the regime change. And the regime change was started with Iraq, then Syria, but it strangely, ironically, never focused towards Saudi Arab, because Osama bin Laden's principal patrons were Saudi Arab and the royal family. He himself was an aristocrat from Saudi Arab. But Saudi Arab people were very close military allies of United States. So for reasons best known to United States and the Saudi alliance, they were not part of the regime change, but everybody else suffered the regime change. And that ultimately ended with destabilization of Afghanistan, which contributed to the birth of the longest lasting war in American history. But all that is events. Then we think in terms of individuals. The chain of events that was triggered by this regime change or the war against terror led to large-scale influx of refugees, which created problems of a different kind in the Western Europe, and also to a certain extent in America. There were accusations of human rights violations, and the refugee crisis and the war against terror took the students' attention, scholars' attention away from issues which were equally important, like institutions that had failed, ideological issues that were emerging, and the lack of unity among the global community to prioritize the challenges and how to cope with them. Then came the COVID. Then just before COVID hit humanity, there was the problem of climate change. But all these issues were basically related to events that had been triggered in the first decade of the 21st century. Then we come to individuals, we come to leaders. The leaders who were in power at the beginning of the 21st century. Only Vladimir Putin of Russia was the one who had assumed power just 1 year before the turn of the century. Nowhere on the stage were the current actors who matter most of all: Xi Jinping of China, Narendra Modi of India, and also Boris Johnson of Britain. And you could add to that the people like Bolsonaro in Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. So this time what we are going to do is to focus on an institution, an international institution that was born. Its birth coincided almost with the turn of the 21st century. It was a British economist who first proposed the idea of the emerging nations taking their rightful place in international affairs. And he mentioned in it Brazil, he mentioned in it Russia, he mentioned India, and he mentioned China. And his reason were that these were the countries which are most populous countries in the world. They were among the first 10 by the count of population or geographical area. They also represented at least 2 members of the Security Council who were veto wielding. It included China, which was the second largest economy. It had emerged by around that time. India was then closer to the 10th place, but very soon it was registering an economic growth that it would juggle between 6th and the 5th place, displacing Great Britain. And then what would happen is that people were discussing that it might very soon take place of G7, which was only the affluent nations of the Western Europe, including Italy as a matter of courtesy for the unity's sake of Western Europe. But then again, time has come to see whether in the past 5-7 years, the expectations of BRIC, which later became BRICS when South Africa was invited to join it in 2010. Formally, the BRIC was formed in 2006 when the foreign ministers of these countries met together and held their first summit. It was building on an earlier existing relationship called IBSA, in which India, Brazil and South Africa were there. But in BRIC, South Africa was not there. And it was a clear-cut definition that the countries which were emerging as regional powers or had ambitions in past of being regional powers would be included in this gathering. One thing which we must keep in mind is that this was a very novel experiment. During the period of Cold War in 20th century, there was a non-aligned group, there was an Afro-Asian Latin American group as a voting bloc in the United Nations, and people talked in terms of East and West, North and South, rich and the poor. Now, this BRICS seemed to bridge all these chasms, and it was representing the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere, the Western world as well as the Eastern world. It was including Asia, Africa and Latin America all in one go. So has it fulfilled the promises, its potential, which people thought it was there? But then we come to individuals. We have mentioned before that Xi Jinping was not there, Mr. Modi was not there, Boris Johnson was not there, Jair Bolsonaro was not there. So, and also Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa was not there. But when we talk in terms of BRICS today, does it give us hope that it can give us a multilateral negotiating forum which can bring about genuine reform in multilateral diplomacy or other international institutions like the United Nations? This is what we shall discuss with you this time. If you jot down the numbers on a piece of paper, they are very impressive. You have almost 40% of the world's population represented in this organization, BRICS. You also have the GDP, which is 20% of the total world GDP among these countries. You have 15 to 16% of the international trade which they share. You have a fair amount of natural resources controlled by these countries. And we did mention before that BRICS had built upon an earlier organization called IBSA, India, Brazil, South Africa, which brought together Latin America, Africa and Asia in one forum. But once it became BRICS, people tend to overlook that it brought two powers which were disproportionately imbalancing the partnership between India, Brazil and South Africa. India had ambitions of more legitimate of being the predominant state in the South Asian region, in having its influence extended to West Asia, Central Asia and Southeast Asia. Brazil was the largest country in the Latin American continent. It had ambitions and it had natural resources and it had the technological and scientific expertise in the field of nuclear research, in the field of space research, in the field of pharmaceuticals, which was comparable to what India could boast of. And there was a time before the Brazil had voluntarily given up its ambition of nuclear weapons production and signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Whether it could afford not to do so is another question, living right under the shadow of America. But the problem is that these powers were more or less comparable. Now, South Africa was a middle upper income country in that continent. It was a resource-rich country, and resource-rich country not on oil, gas and coal, but gold and diamonds and minerals and uranium and things of that kind. And these three countries were geostrategically located ideally in three different continents. So one could imagine that they were comparable countries, they were emerging countries in their own region, and they had, if they combined their resources together, they could play a significant enough role in countervailing the ideological clashes in the world elsewhere. But when Russia and China were added, is worth repeating again, it totally changed the nature of this. So fine, then it is no point saying that they represent 40% of the world's population. It goes without saying that China is the most populous nation. India is the second most populous nation. So the balance in the terms of population is tilted. China is a large country geographically, and so is Brazil, so is Russia. India is not a small country by any reckoning, but it is no point placing these countries together on a table of 1 to 10 because they are not proportionate. Now, China is a permanent member of the Security Council, veto wielding. So is Russia. Now, it is difficult to imagine that their interests, which they are quite capable of protecting using their own veto, their military muscle, is not comparable to Brazil, South Africa or India. One claim to be a superpower, claiming parity with the United States. People's Republic of China goes one step ahead. It has ambitions of becoming the sole unipolar superpower, hyperpower, and displacing America for the #1 position in the international affairs. So how do we imagine that they would not have a clash of interest? So the kind of ideological neutrality with which they began, the Brazilians, the South Africans and Indians, changed drastically the composition of the group. If there were two countries which had at one time been hardcore communist countries, you could say that Putin's Russia has changed considerably from the doctrinaire Brezhnev's Russia, or after the perestroika and glasnost came. Again, Boris Yeltsin's Russia was different. But then again, the economic power or resource base or technological skills, especially in the field of military hardware or space technology, is not comparable to the Indian space potential or India's nuclear power production for peaceful purposes. Partly they have been assisted from foreign countries, partly we have built up our own resources and self-reliance. But ever since India tested nuclear weapons, Pokhran 1, Pokhran 2, the Western countries have tried to cripple our nuclear energy program, nuclear for peace program. But India has asserted its autonomy, but it has led to certain restrictions on dual-use technology, and even Russians have had at times to play the ball with the Western powers and restrict their cooperation to India. India has been a very large buyer of Russian military hardware, fair enough. So there was a coincidence of interest. But in the past decade, India has diversified its resources of weapons procurement, and we have drifted ever since we drew closer to America away from Russia. Not entirely our own doing. Putin has also turned Europewards, and the Eurasian Russia, the Asian part of Russia, China is far more important for Russia at the moment. So again, there are these inner splits, but divergences, very clear-cut divergences in national interest between these 5 member states. Now again, when this organization came into being, we were not looking for other rival organizations which will come here. Since then, the Russians have come out, the Chinese have come out with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Now this organization again has Russia, again has China, has Central Asian republics. India is a part of this, invited as a special invitee, then almost extended as a membership. But the problem is that again, if you see that if Russians and the Chinese have a forum in which to discuss their shared coincidence or overlapping national interest, how do you imagine that these two countries would again voluntarily be making compromises, concessions in the BRICS? So that is one major issue which people chose not to look at, and they went through regular summits. And again, before we proceed any further, an interesting thing about the structure of the membership of the BRICS is there. It is an annually rotating chair, which starts alphabetically with Brazil, then it goes to Russia, this time it is with India, then it will move over to China and come next after that to South Africa. Now this again takes us to a very interesting situation. If the next chair is Russia, and the Russia has a different set of priorities vis-a-vis the West, Europe, America, Britain, EU, has an energy diplomacy of its own. Putin's Russia also has ambition to be active in West Asia, on the northern tip of Africa. It has an uneasy or tense relationship, off and on, hot and cold, with Turkey. It is at times on the same side with Iran, say about the negotiations of Taliban and Afghanistan. It has a different relationship with countries in Caucasus, Azerbaijan and Armenia, and Kazakhstan. China is very, very important for it. So how do we presume that BRICS will have a coincidence of interest when the chairperson changes? When India is there, can India set the agenda of BRICS for more than the term of its chair? Can it punch much above its weight to persuade Russia and China to pursue that agenda? There have been issues in past which have shown where the balance of power in the BRICS lies. They mooted a bank, the BRICS Development Bank, but the bank was headquartered in Shanghai. That's where the money was. That's where the financial muscle was. There was so much of a gap between China's economy and even India's economy, which is after China among the member countries the closest there. But it doesn't make sense. So you cannot have the Chinese control the development bank, the BRICS Development Bank, have much greater economic muscle than anybody else. And then we come to that. After Russia, the chair will pass on to China. Now, when it passes on to China, we have to worry about the contradictions which are glaring. India and China have a major military conflict brewing on the Himalayan land border. There is potential of a clash in the South China Sea, in the Indian Ocean region, and India's membership of the Quad had raised eyebrows in China. China had minced no words about telling India that it should not fall prey into this American conspiracy to divide the Asian nations among themselves. And China built up the argument of the unity of Asian nations, their past being different, etc. So when China becomes the chair, it is going to be much more difficult than even the Russia being in chair. So how does India cope with that situation? Now, it's one thing to say that after 2 years, it will pass back again, the chair will pass back again to Brazil. This leads us to the fundamental weakness of the BRICS institution, that the member states have different degrees of political stability and economic development sustained. It is one thing to make a statement that all of us stand for renewable energy, all of us stay with cooperation, all of us stay for respecting each other's sovereignty, all of us stay with rule-based system, all of us are there for innovation, etc. But when we come to this, we look at it that what is happening in Brazil. So is there hope that when Brazil is in chair, it can provide leadership to the BRICS? Again, its state of weakness vis-a-vis Russia and China is one thing. It's being under the influence of America, right, although the Monroe Doctrine is no longer mentioned in so many explicit words, but America does control whatever happens in the Latin American subcontinent, its backyard. Right now we are seeing it happen about the refugees in Mexico. We are having the conflict with Venezuela. But that apart, Brazil itself is being ruled by a leader who's an authoritarian, dictatorial ruler. Before we go any further, we must say that there are some scholars who maintain that the whole world is moving towards the authoritarian regime, even elected authoritarian people, benevolent despots. Some would suggest that Mr. Modi is an elected benevolent despot. Some would say that Xi Jinping has manipulated the electoral system within the Communist Party to become autocrat. Some would say that Putin in Russia again represents one of these things. Boris Johnson is not particularly democratic. He is economical with truth and not always respectful of the parliamentary procedures or even the electorate. So one could argue that this is not a criticism of Bolsonaro of Brazil, but where Bolsonaro stands out is that there hundreds of thousands of people have come out in protest against his mishandling of COVID crisis, mishandling of economy, widespread corruptions, his conspiratorial alliances with military generals, although some military generals have now come out against him. So it is difficult to imagine that this man may remain in power by the time the chair passes on to Brazil. More or less the same kind of a thing can be said about South Africa. Cyril Ramaphosa has inherited a regime which is fraught with many difficult challenges. His immediate predecessor, Zuma, was charged with corruption. He is arrested in jail. He has tried to get bail on health grounds repeatedly. His arrest has triggered off riots there. But the lawlessness, the instability of the race, the volatility of the race relationship leading to political instability, and the South African elected government headed by Cyril Ramaphosa has to cope with the COVID, which the rest of the world has not lent them even a symbolic helping hand. They have a law and order problem, they have a race relation problem, they have a rich and poor problem. They also have a population which is very easily swayed to primordial tribal loyalties. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission managed to keep the communal violence between the colored people and the whites at bay. But recent riots have shown that while the rich white remain safe in their enclosures with their private armies protecting themselves, the other people of color, like the Indians, have been targeted by the so-called original inhabitants of the continent, and there is a different kind of the race relation violence is emerging in this country. It is on paper an upper middle income developed country in Africa, but this has not really been realized. If the country remains to be controlled by multinational corporations, which are ultimately one step removed, controlled by the erstwhile colonial masters, and there has been no healing actually in South Africa. Now, one could again argue that there has been no healing in even People's Republic of China, whether it comes to Tibet, whether it comes to Hong Kong, whether it comes to Xinjiang province and Uyghur Muslims. Similar arguments could be put against India. It could be said about Britain, that the kind of divisions they have in Scotland and Wales and North Ireland, and the rich and the poor and the people of color. So what started in America with Black Lives Matter had reverberations all over the world, and none of these countries was safe. Then again, there are issues of economic development in post-COVID world. All economies have suffered equally traumatically, but the BRICS members are particularly hard hit, because take for instance the case of Brazil. If it wants to develop fast, and that is what the argument of Bolsonaro and his supporters is, we cannot do so if we keep our Amazon rainforest and don't encash it. Encashing Amazon rainforest means havoc with biodiversity, havoc with the indigenous way of life, and violation of human rights, allowing multinational companies to come in and have long-term exploitative leases like they have on the African continent. Now, the trouble is, China has set for itself a target which is very unrealistic about cutting down the carbon footprint. Now, it is already showing signs of economic slowdown, although during the post-COVID, China was one country among the members of BRICS which had registered a positive development growth. Even if you discount for the veracity, credibility of the statistics, you cannot deny that even in the last quarter of this year, last 3 months which have just passed, they have registered a growth of close to 5%, 4.9%, which is lower than what they were registering before, but the rest of the world has not even done that. Some economists believe that in the last 3 months of the current year, the growth rate might even fall down a little more. It might be 3.5, but the fact is undeniable that China still would have registered an economic growth in positive terms, while the other members of the BRICS will be hard put to juggle with figures and show it. India, for instance, has fallen in the hunger index. We may say this is a conspiracy, we may say the figures are not reliable, but the point remains that one can see around us inflation, one can see around us unemployment, one can see around us in our own country social cleavages, which have resulted in the curtailment of freedom of expression, draconian laws, things of that kind, and at times erosion of the independence of institutions. So who are we to criticize the erosion of institutions elsewhere? But here we are not to make value judgments. We are here to say that there was a forum, that it had a potential to play a constructive role in international affairs, and the dissonances, the divergences in national interests of its member countries were overlooked in enthusiasm, and we thought that everything would fall in place with passage of time. This has not happened. The recent summit in September 2021 brought out that more than rhetoric, there is nothing which this forum is capable of doing. We again said that the Chinese leader Xi Jinping made a very, very hard-hitting speech, hard-hitting rhetorically. He said we must respect each other's sovereignty, we must be transparent, we must be innovative, we must go for sustainable development, we must share the challenges which face the mankind together, like climate change and vaccine. But if you look at the Chinese conduct, it goes right against that. Take the Sino-Indian relations. There is no transparency in border negotiations. There is no credibility about the commitments which Chinese undertake. But the fact remains that the Chinese have infiltrated, if there is no better word, or penetrated so much the economies of Western countries that, forget about the member states, nobody can do without sustained Chinese economic growth, because it will impact on their own economic growth. They are dependent on telecom technology. They are dependent on pharmaceutical intermediaries. The whole world owes China so much, and China is following a different diplomatic strategy of its own, one belt, one road, and trying to extend itself in Africa, in Latin America. It has interesting presence in Peru. This is something which we must keep in mind. There is another thing which we must keep in mind is this, that when BRICS was formed, the hope was that these major countries, Brazil, India, South Africa, let's keep aside Russia and China at the moment, would spearhead the egalitarian movement in their respective continents. Slowly the membership would increase, slowly the benefits of membership of BRICS would be shared by everybody, prosperity would be shared, scientific research would be shared, they would be partners in progress. This has not happened. Brazil has not attracted members on its own continent. India has failed to do so in South Asia. The only countries which have managed to extend their influence are Russia and China. South Africa is beset, as we said, by difficulties of its own. So when we keep all these things in mind, we have to think carefully, objectively about the limitations or failures of BRICS. And if we are talking in terms of failures of BRICS, how many multilateral fora can coexist having the same kind of agenda and overlapping each other and diluting each other's equity? This is what we must carefully consider. So where do we go from here? If we realize that the BRICS is not the organization which it promised to be at the turn of the century, the past 2 decades have been a long list of failures, if not outright failures, of lack of progress, of stagnation, partly because the member states have been embroiled with their domestic issues, partly because after COVID it doesn't seem likely that the world is moving towards structures which are not looking to past but looking to future. Interestingly, the Chinese Prime Minister, when he was making a speech at the last summit of BRICS, said that wise men adjust to change and experienced men try to live with change. Now he always has this knack of bringing out an old Chinese phrase which can be interpreted ambiguously to suit Chinese interests. So are we accepting that the Chinese are the wise, who are resilient, who are learning to live with change, or are they adjusting to change? Now, either way, what the Chinese can do, the option is not open to other members. The option perhaps is open to only one other member, that is India. India cannot be written off. India is an ancient civilization. India has a great potential. India may not have performed very well in the past 2 years due to COVID, due to domestic unrest, due to tensions of various kind, due to various pulls and pressures of a democratic federal polity. And let's not forget that India has been exposed to a very dastardly attack, prolonged attack of terrorism from its next door neighbor. The Chinese have tried to confront India and retard and cripple its economic growth by forcing it to have increased its defense budget, have to deploy an army on the Himalayan borderland, also to worry about the marine trade in South China Sea and Indian Ocean. So India has not been left with much option. India cannot overlook the Chinese military threat. India has a trade imbalance which is $35 billion vis-a-vis China, and now the present government is not responsible for it. We go back to a time when Mr. Manmohan Singh, the then Prime Minister of India, said that our trade with China is so important, so delicate, so large that we should put the border dispute on the back burner. The result is that people took their eyes off the ball, and the Chinese are now having such an ingratiating presence in our economy that we cannot overnight change it. So, nor can the European nations, nor can America itself. But the fact is that India still has the potential to push back, and it is not a pushover, and the Indians can think in terms of self-reliance, but India cannot think in terms of only self-reliance. It will have to think in terms of interdependence. Prime Minister Modi at one time had, through his dramatic, hectic diplomatic missions, tried to open all options for India. He had opened an option with Japan, opened an option with European Union, opened an option with United States, and he was using Indian diaspora to very good use. But the point is, the circumstances have changed. Each country is following a self-reliant policy. America first, China first, and India is not in a position like China, where every country will say India is indispensable for them. Some of the Indian hopes have been belied. When people were having a trade war against China, they did not move the companies to India, they moved them to Taiwan, Vietnam and Thailand. So time probably has come for India to rethink its long-term plan for economic development, not try to compete with China at the rate of economic growth which cannot be sustained. Think in terms of economic growth and equity at home. Think in terms of lowering the temperature in terms of communal passions. Think in terms of a federal polity. Think in terms of reinforcing its independence of its institutions. And once we have a strong democracy, we have a strong economy, we can probably do with a slightly lower rate of growth, but not worry about that and try to find our moorings again. This is what we have for you this week. We would like you to think this through, not only BRICS, you think about different regional powers, emerging powers. People are talking in terms of Turkey as an emerging power. People are talking of Korea despite all the problems it has with North Korea, all the problems it has, but it has a very large market in China. It is cutting edge technology in memory chips, in other chips, in artificial intelligence, in biotechnology. Now we talk of our expertise, but we have little to show on grounds like small country like Korea has to show. It is indispensable for both Apple and both for the Chinese companies. And it is preparing itself for a day when Taiwan might not be there, might be peacefully or otherwise be a part of China. So India too has to think in terms of a disturbed, uneasy neighborhood, enemies on all fronts, North China, West Pakistan, East China again towards the marine competition, and India will have to worry about all this and still find its feet and push back. That is what we must think about. You must think about. Till we meet again next week. Thank you and goodbye.